All right, it looks like our number has stabilized for the moment. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to get started with the program. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on California's climate adaptation and resilience landscape. My name is Ted Lamb, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, also known as CLEE. As many of you are aware, CLEE is a policy research center that helps to link the expertise and creativity of the Berkeley law community into pragmatic policy solutions to environmental and energy challenges. We work with government, business, and the nonprofit sector to help solve urgent problems that require innovative and often interdisciplinary approaches. Through our Lunch and Learn series, we host conversations on a range of environmental topics, including unpacking complex and pressing policy issues and presenting new and innovative research findings. The Lunch and Learn series is made possible through the support of our sponsors, Wilson Sonsini, Oric, Hanson Bridget, and Water and Power Law Group, and we thank them all for their support. A brief note on the agenda for today's webinar before we get started. I will briefly introduce our topic and our three panelists who are here with me now. They will then open the webinar with slides and remarks on California's climate adaptation and resilience programs and findings from their recent work. This will take us to about the 20 or 25-minute mark. Then we'll open it up for a panel discussion with an audience Q&A, which I will moderate. So please use the Q&A function on Zoom to share your questions, and feel free to do so throughout the session. They will sit there, and we'll get to them once the Q&A starts. So don't wait to ask a question until we start. Can we please pull up the slideshow? Awesome, thank you, Kayla. So the focus of today's webinar, as I said, is California's climate adaptation and resilience grant programs, and in particular, the way the state funds and implements those programs. California has developed a comprehensive adaptation and resilience framework as part of its approach to climate change, and this framework includes a suite of investments at the state and local level. CLEE has studied these programs over the past year in collaboration with the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Change, which is previously known as the Office of Planning and Research, and which administers and oversees many of those adaptation and resilience programs. Our team recently published the third and final report in the series, titled Bridging the Implementation Gap, Challenges and Opportunities for California's Resilience Funding Landscape. We'll share links to all the project materials and reports in the chat throughout the session. You can also find them on our website. And this report will be one of the main focal points of today's discussion. So as a brief intro to the topic, the cost of inaction on adaptation and resilience grows every day. We're seeing this every day in the news and in our communities. This is from wildfire and flooding to economic and social disruption. But with the state facing budget challenges across all of its climate programs, there's a clear need for new strategic approaches to funding these crucial investments. Today's speakers will discuss these challenges and what state leaders can do to overcome them. It's my pleasure to introduce three of our climate research fellows who have spearheaded the project over the last year. Hannah Payne, whose work concentrates on the intersection of climate change and land use, emphasizing equity-oriented adaptation and resilience building initiatives across the climate, conservation, and housing sectors. Kasia Dahlbeck, whose work focuses on policy and governance frameworks for the equitable development of climate infrastructure, including strategies for equity-oriented adaptation and resilience initiatives. And Shruti Sarod, whose work emphasizes addressing the complexities of decarbonizing transportation and energy systems while driving promising climate strategies to policy and scale. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the team, and Hannah is going to kick it off, introducing our recent work and previewing some of the key findings that we're going to discuss today. Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you. Today, we're excited to present the findings from our recent report series on California's adaptation and resilience funding landscape. So this project was completed in partnership with the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program and the California Governor's Office on Land Use and Climate Change. It was initially envisioned to evaluate two of ICARP's adaptation and resilience grant programs. First, the Regional Resilience Planning and Implementation Grant Program, referred to as RRGP, and the Adaptation Planning Grant Program, referred to as APGP. We published findings from those two evaluations in January and June of this year, and as Ted mentioned, those reports can be found on our website. However, following the approval of the 2024 state budget, which reverted funds for both APGP and RRGP, our team identified the need for a landscape-level review of the state's adaptation and resilience funding ecosystem. Given the known cost savings of investing in adaptation as well as the crucial role that state investment programs play in supporting both community-led adaptation projects and regional projects, we wanted to identify opportunities for California to build on the successes of programs like APGP and RRGP and develop a more robust funding landscape in alignment with the state's broader climate adaptation framework. So today, we first want to provide some additional context for how the APGP and RRGP program evaluations motivated this broader review of the status of state funding for adaptation. Next slide, please. We'll follow that with a presentation of our preliminary analysis of California's adaptation and resilience funding landscape, including the 3 key challenges that ultimately limit the effectiveness in state investments. And then finally, we'll discuss the policy recommendations from our latest report, Bridging the Implementation Gap, which identify opportunities for the state to strengthen the funding landscape by building on past and ongoing commitments to advancing climate resilience. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Shruti to get us started on the program evaluations of APGP and RRGP.
Thank you, Hannah. So as Hannah mentioned, in 2023 and 2024, CLEE evaluated 2 of the ICARB grant programs, APGP and RRGP. Both of these programs were launched under the 2021 Budget Act, and they completed their first funding rounds. And each of these programs anticipated 3 cycles of funding based on the initial budget allocations to them. And these grants aim to advance climate resilience by supporting collaborative, multi-risk adaptation and resilience projects. And CLEE's evaluation focused on their early outcomes like the program design, accessibility, and demand. Next slide, please. So our evaluations found that both of these programs were very strong additions to the state's adaptation funding portfolio, and both of these programs increased access to funds for adaptation planning. And this is generally considered to be an area that is very difficult to fund. And in round 1, $14 million were awarded for planning projects, whereas round 2 of APGP saw $140 million in funding requests. And both of these programs funded multi-risk and multi-sector projects, addressing challenges like sea level rise, extreme heat, and wildfire, while encouraging innovative cross-sector collaboration. And they also supported local governance by offering flexibility and aligning with the community priorities by using broad definitions of adaptation and resilience strategies. Next slide, please. So our evaluations also included case studies from both of these programs, which highlighted projects that were funded in each program's first round. One example from APGP is the Yosemite Slough Neighborhood Adaptation Plan. This plan was led by the City and County of San Francisco. And this project will address the disparities in climate resilience, especially related to coastal risks such as sea level rise and flooding, also environmental justice and the racial and social equity between Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood and the rest of San Francisco. And through our interviews with the grantees, we learned that the APGP plays a very important role in making the city eligible for federal grants, and also it supports more robust community outreach compensation. And this is a step which is very necessary to ensure equitable participation in the plan's development process. And another example from our case studies is from the project RRGP. It's the Santa Ana River Watershed Climate Adaptation and Resilience Plan. And this project tackles multiple climate risks that threaten watershed resources and nearby communities. These risks include extreme heat, drought, flooding, sea level rise, and wildfire. And the planning process for this project is designed to be multi-sectoral, and it bridges the gap between the traditionally siloed actors and those historically excluded from decision-making processes around water resilience strategies. And RRGP was critical in enabling this large-scale regional planning effort for this project. Next slide, please. So these case studies show how crucial RRGP and APGP have been for adaptation and resilience in California. However, the 2024 state budget reverted funds for the future rounds of these programs. And this suggested to us that there was a need to review the broader adaptation funding landscape and find ways to build on the successes of these two programs. And ICAR staff designed and implemented both of these programs in a manner that was responsive to the frequent feedback they got regarding the accessible and equitable funding. And these models should be continuously refined and built on to address the shifting community needs. And also, it's really important to identify the continuing challenges for funding adaptation efforts so that the landscape can be responsive to those challenges that rather than mirroring these challenges. I'll now hand it over to Kasia, who will discuss the challenges in the state's grant program landscape.
Thank you, Shruti. Our preliminary analysis of California's resilience funding portfolio consisted of a landscape mapping of 52 of the state's adaptation and resilience grant programs, which, while not exhaustive, is broadly representative of the funding landscape. Next slide, please. Thank you. This analysis revealed 3 intersecting challenges present throughout the state's funding portfolio, in line with previous work analyzing the state's adaptation and resilience funding landscape. These challenges were oversubscription, instability, and complexity, each highlighting opportunities for strategic intervention that we'll get into a bit later on. First, state adaptation and resilience grant programs are highly oversubscribed, or demand for state dollars significantly outweighs the funding that's available. The state funding landscape is also characterized by instability. Programs are often only active for a few years and subject to state budget fluctuations over time. Finally, the funding landscape for resilience in California is complex. Funding is distributed through a large number of programs and siloed administering agencies, many with different eligibility and application requirements that impact the ability of applicants to access available funding. All of these challenges are highly nuanced, but I'll give a brief overview in the following slides. In terms of oversubscription, our analysis of a subset of adaptation grant programs that operated roughly contemporaneously with APGP and RRGP showed that all were significantly oversubscribed, many by over 700%. The average level of oversubscription across this group was 652%, or in other words, 652% more funding was requested through program applications than was available to disperse through these programs. Now, high demand for adaptation funding is a widely experienced challenge as climate hazards pose increasingly high economic costs. Fully satisfying this scale of investment cannot fall to the state alone and will require layering funding and financing from state and local governments, the private sector, philanthropy, and other sources. However, state adaptation policy and funding are essential for preparing local jurisdictions to adapt to climate change and take advantage of alternative funding channels. And within state-provided funding, areas of especially high perceived need and associated competition that came through in our interviews with program grantees were funding for planning projects, funding for regional scale projects, and funding that allowed applicants to identify priority climate risks in their communities. Next slide, please. This high demand for state funding is complemented by the challenges of funding instability, or the uncertain nature of funding availability, depending on budget resources and natural fluctuations over time. Of the 52 programs included in CLEE's analysis, 15 had information on funding availability for future rounds. This uncertain nature of funding availability has a few notable impacts on California's adaptation and resilience landscape. First, it exacerbates barriers to advancing equity for under-resourced applicants with limited staff capacity to seek funding that may or may not be available. It also limits opportunities for grant programs to improve and demonstrate value between grant award rounds over time. And finally, it can inhibit the effectiveness of resilience activities that naturally require ongoing maintenance and support, such as vegetation management for wildfire protection and resilience. And finally, California state funding for adaptation and resilience is distributed through a complex web of administering agencies, many with their own application processes and eligibility requirements. For example, 17 different agencies and departments administered the 52 grants mapped in this analysis. This poses navigational barriers for applicants. CLEE's evaluations of both APGP and RRGP identified funding navigation as a significant challenge. And this complexity present in the state funding landscape generates a few issues. First, barriers to, again, advancing equity in the application process, as often local jurisdictions least likely to have staff dedicated to seeking out, preparing, and diversifying grant applications may be the most in need of support for adaptation planning and implementation dollars. It also generates duplicative work by state grant program staff carrying out concurrent award processes. With limited existing resources for adaptation, these inefficiencies can contribute to hindering effective fund deployment and limit the ultimate return on investment for state dollars. APGP and RRGP sought to address the challenges identified in this analysis through their program design, and lessons learned from their program implementation have contributed to the opportunities we've identified for strengthening the state's adaptation landscape covered in the next section. And with that, I'll hand it over to Hannah.
Thanks, Kasha. So as Kasha mentioned, while these challenges of the funding landscape are nuanced, they do suggest multiple opportunities for the state to refine its approach to adaptation funding and build on a track record of investments in climate science and community-led adaptation initiatives that have put California really at the forefront of a lot of this climate work. We at CLEE identified 3 recommendations aimed at helping to improve the funding landscape through this work. We believe state grant administrators should focus on actions that specifically maximize the resilience outcomes of existing funding programs, while state policymakers can take steps to make adaptation resilience funding more accessible and develop strategies for sustaining and maintaining predictable funding for adaptation and resilience efforts over time. So first, maximizing the resilience outcomes of existing funding programs is really important for building long-term capacity for adaptation, especially under difficult budget conditions. We identified opportunities for state grant program administrators to maximize outcomes by elevating and facilitating plan alignment, which is the process of leveraging connections, information, and resources across multiple planning efforts at any scale. Encouraging plan alignment can help ensure that money, staff time, and staff capacity, all often limiting factors for success in a complex funding landscape, are used both efficiently and effectively, helping to address some of the challenges of that complexity that Kasha talked about in the last section. We also recommend that program administrators advance local governance in adaptation strategies and solutions in order to maximize resilience outcomes. Advancing local decision-making power over how adaptation projects are conceptualized, designed, and implemented is crucial for enabling equitable adaptation and avoiding maladaptive outcomes in communities. Local governance also ensures that implementation of projects addresses the highest priority needs as identified by impacted communities, which helps ensure equitable outcomes. Second, making adaptation and resilience funding more accessible can help ensure that distributed funds advance equitable resilience outcomes. We identified opportunities for state policymakers to increase funding accessibility by institutionalizing support for applicants who are navigating the state funding landscape. Institutionalized support, which could potentially come to fruition through a centralized grant support hub within a single state agency, can help ensure that allocated funds are both impactful and equitably distributed, especially in this really complex landscape. We believe ICARP is pretty well positioned to fill this formal navigation role. And we learned through our evaluations and conversations with staff that they often play an informal navigation role already, and that with appropriate support from the state, ICARP could continue to support applicants in navigating various funding opportunities, both within the state and to better understand opportunities beyond. We also recommend that policymakers better align state funding opportunities with federal, private, and nonprofit funding sources. The high cost of adaptation requires a holistic approach to funding, capitalizing on federal climate investments and private and nonprofit dollars. Aligning state funding opportunities with these other funding sources will help build stability in California's funding landscape while addressing known gaps and areas of high competition. We believe the state should design its funding programs to be strategically linked to other existing grant programs and funding sources, and encourage applicants to develop holistic funding plans so that they can have balanced funding portfolios that support their projects throughout the life cycle. Finally, sustaining and maintaining predictable funding for adaptation and resilience is necessary to ensure that the state can meet the adaptation needs of its communities over time. California has a significant opportunity to build on past and ongoing investments in both climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives. We see a role for the state in more proactively outlining a funding strategy that complements existing efforts to institutionalize adaptation and resilience as a top priority for California. Specifically, we recommend that the legislature and governor's office work together to develop a comprehensive funding and investment strategy that aligns with the priorities of California's climate adaptation strategy. This funding strategy should clearly articulate the state's long-term goals for improving the funding adaptation landscape. It should also outline the state's plan for funding projects through their life cycle, prioritize the development of flexible and hazard-agnostic funds, and provide a framework for linking multiple funding types so applicants can develop these balanced financing plans. We note that several publications have explored this and similar topics over the last few years, and these helped inform our recommendations. So we suggest that if the state pursues an adaptation funding strategy, it should leverage these other resources and recommendations, many of which come from grassroots organizations and community practitioners with on-the-ground experience. The development and implementation of this funding strategy should also be guided by input from a working group or advisory body of experts and community representatives who can provide both oversight and context for regions and areas of particularly high need. Finally, the funding strategy should be updated concurrently with the state's climate adaptation strategy to ensure that the state's planning processes and investment strategies are well aligned. Together, these recommendations are designed to concurrently address multiple challenges of California's adaptation funding landscape while making maximum use of existing resources, considering the budget context. The state's been a longtime leader in climate, resulting in an excellent foundation for building a robust and equitable funding strategy and ensuring that resilience is achievable for all of California's communities. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you to all three of you for some really fascinating information and also condensing a lot of 12 plus months of work and multiple reports into a very concise and compelling presentation. So thank you for that. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and I encourage the audience to keep those coming in. We'll get to those in just a moment. I want to kick off with a couple of my own, or at least one of my own, before we turn to the audience questions, and then we can go from there. So the question I wanted to ask all three of you is, you've talked about the sort of the history and background of these programs. You've talked about California as a leader in the adaptation and resilience funding space. Can you just give us a little bit of context for the extent to which other states and or the federal government are funding programs in this area? What does it look like for California to be leading in this space? How innovative and large are these programs? And then maybe a second question to that, Kasha, building off a point that you made, can you just talk a little bit more about what is meant by oversubscription to these programs? To what extent is the 700% oversubscription that you mentioned a problem? Was it evidence of? How much oversubscription should we expect, and what other kinds of funding sources do fill some of that gap? So first, the big question, just a little bit of context here. I don't know if Hannah, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Great question. So California is, as we've noted, a leader on climate in a couple of different areas, right? The federal government, especially in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, has made some significant investments. But a lot of these investments have been primarily in implementation projects and implementation work, especially around infrastructure and adapting to climate impacts at these kind of fairly large scales. However, federal funds have been slightly less focused on planning efforts, and this is a space where California has been particularly innovative in funding adaptation resilience planning projects that then can help make communities eligible for federal funds, which we talked about a little bit earlier. A lot of these federal programs require that communities, jurisdictions already have an adaptation plan in place in order to then fund those strategies. So that's a significant way in which California as a state is addressing some of these gaps in the broader kind of national funding landscape. We also want to note that while we did not survey grant programs in states besides California, we're aware of a handful of others that are doing kind of similar approaches. So, for example, the state of Washington, specifically the Department of Health, has a climate adaptation initiative grant program. This program is a capacity building grant. So instead of funding specific projects, it funds organizations that work on health and climate justice and health and climate equity issues, but really seeks to address some of the same adaptation, particularly equity issues in adaptation that some of California's programs are designed to fill. So that's an example of a similar program with a strong focus on health and climate equity. And I'm sure quite a few others exist, but this was one we wanted to highlight. I'll just quickly say that our hope in publishing these program evaluations in particular, so I'm talking about the APGP and the RRGP program evaluations, is that we can highlight the design and implementation process for these programs, specifically all of the work that went in on the back end to really make sure these programs were designed with communities in mind, so that other programs in California and across the states can learn from both successes and areas for improvement, because we recognize that these programs can always be built on and improved. I think I'm going to hand over to Kasia to tackle that second question, but happy to continue afterwards if you have additional thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, really, really great and important questions that have emerged throughout this work. The oversubscription that we see for the state's grant programs in adaptation and resilience really speaks to the high demand for adaptation funding, which is not unique to California. It's experienced universally. There's simply not enough adaptation funding in order to meet the demand that we see. And just a couple of reference points, a study about LA adaptation found that the county would need to spend at least $12.5 billion through 2040 to adapt Los Angeles County to climate change. And our grantees from different types of cities have noted that, for example, a medium-sized city would need funding support in the range of about $1.1 billion to $3.5 billion in order to support adaptation efforts in those cities. So we're talking about enormous amounts of financial support in order to build resilience in California's communities. Of course, some oversubscription is to be expected in state grants. Many state grants are competitive processes, and it is normal to have higher than 100% subscription to these programs. However, when we're seeing numbers over 700%, for example, the second round of APGP was oversubscribed by 1,444%. We're seeing something a little bit out of the norm. We're seeing that this demand is extremely high, and local jurisdictions throughout California really are in need of support for adaptation planning now and implementation dollars. Now, there are other sources of adaptation funding, which is again, really important that the state is able to strategically support the layering of funding and financing sources. So those can be federal funding programs, private and philanthropic funds, even different types of formula grants. So definitely not a responsibility that would be reasonable to place on the state alone. But the broader funding landscape for adaptation and resilience definitely has a lot of space to grow and continue to strategically utilize the resources that do exist to better support communities on the ground.
And Kasia, thank you for that. And one sort of quick follow-up from the Q&A on this, which is an audience member notes that a recent Caltrans planning program was 106% oversubscribed versus the 1,444% you mentioned for the second round of one of the two funding programs. Any thoughts on why you see such a substantial oversubscription rate for these programs in particular, when, as you said, some oversubscription is to be expected and is part of program design?
Definitely. I'm happy to start off on this one, and then I'll open it to others if anyone has things to add. But one reason why these programs were such positive additions to the state's funding portfolio is because they offered a few different types of program design that are not necessarily covered in other programs that are more specific. So some of those factors that really contribute are things like funding regional scale projects, or funding multi-risk projects, or funding both planning and implementation, which opens a much broader set of potential applicants than a more specific program. So I would say it's due to the broad applicability of these programs to a different suite of climate risks and types of projects. But of course, there's a wide range within the oversubscription of different programs.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a couple of questions from the Q&A that wrap up with something that I also wanted to ask you guys about, which is on the projects themselves that have been funded or are being funded. Broadly speaking, Shruti, you give a little bit of detail on a couple of the case studies. I'm wondering if you could give just a little bit more sort of background on what kinds of projects are these two main programs funding? What are sort of unique about them? And in particular, some questions in the Q&A around how do the adaptation and resilience goals fit with conservation and biodiversity goals? To what extent do they overlap? And habitat resilience, how does that play into any of these projects or these planning efforts? So big question, maybe just a little bit more dive on some of the case study work that you did.
Yeah, I can answer the first part of the question. So going back to the priorities of APGP that they mentioned, it's like they explicitly and meaningfully prioritize equitable outcomes, all of these projects that were funded by APGP and RRGP, and they also encourage communities to equitably plan and respond to multiple climate risks like sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat, as I mentioned before. And a lot of these projects also plan to like build more statewide capacity to plan for and implement like equitable planning strategies and like replicate it also throughout the state. And yeah, so it's the same for APGP, and RRGP also explicitly prioritized equity-oriented projects. And like both of these, like for APGP and RRGP, there were a lot of funds that were distributed for like disadvantaged communities, and also there were like tribal set aside eligible projects. And to talk about the case studies, an example of an RRGP implementation project that I didn't talk about in the presentation is the land stewardship project, which is led by the Machibda tribe. And in this project, the tribe and its regional partners in the Butte and Plumas counties will build tribal workforce capacity and climate resilience by creating and funding a tribal land stewardship and prescribed fire crew. And in our interview with them, we learned that RRGP was like, they built this project because they heard about the RRGP opportunity. So RRGP was very crucial, as a very crucial resource for supporting their intertribal collaboration and strengthening the nation-to-nation relationships with the RRGP funding. And this tribal collaborative will also build on social and economic resilience through workforce development. So there's like very different kinds of projects that were funded by APGP and RRGP. Hannah or Kasia, would you like to take the second part of the project about the biodiversity? I wasn't sure.
Biodiversity, habitat conservation, other associated maybe co-benefits that might come with adaptation and resilience projects. How are those reflected in the program design or the projects that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to tackle that. I think a handful of projects, probably the majority that were funded in these first rounds of APGP and RRGP, can result in co-benefits for ecosystem services, habitat, biodiversity, and conservation. But more broadly, frankly, the state's funding landscape for adaptation and resilience covers a really broad group of sectors, and that includes sectors focused on natural and working lands. So lands where we're really seeing kind of a high focus by the state right now, especially with the 30 by 30 initiative on conservation and preservation efforts, and climate smart land management efforts. And there are quite a few climate resilience grant programs that the state's funded in the past and that may have funding moving forward. I can't remember if any of them are specifically in those 15 that we noted have information. And I know there have been some updates, especially in the past couple of weeks, on funding availability for future years. And so there might be some changes there. But quite a few grant programs there focused on restoration activities and conservation activities. We may talk about this a little bit later, but recently the state passed Proposition 4, familiarly referred to as the climate bond. And quite a lot of funding that may become available through the climate bond will be focused on adaptation and resilience, with a pretty significant portion of that funding directed towards water resilience projects. And that tends to be an area where we're really focused on watershed and landscape conservation efforts that can help improve drought conditions, but also address issues around stream restoration, and a variety of kind of biodiversity and conservation related topics. So I appreciate that question because I think these are really interrelated, even if not kind of explicitly identified as goals within these two particular state grant programs.
And Hannah, maybe just building off of that response and a couple more questions that have come in the Q&A. Can you guys talk a little bit about how the passage of the climate bond, which really is a much broader than just a climate bond, but can you just talk about what's in there, what the passage means for not necessarily the programs that you guys are talking about, but the focus areas that you're talking about? And then this sort of relates to a question more broadly about how can the state grow the pot of money to fund these kinds of programs, given the oversubscription that you've described? Are there strategies that are available? Is it more bonds like this one? Does this bond do the trick? Maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great follow-up question, Ted. So I guess I'll start off. The bond is really important. The passage of the bond is absolutely a win for helping to fund really critical climate and environmental projects, especially in the face of a really challenging budget situation. And it's going to play a really significant role in ensuring that California is still able to make progress on building resilience for communities. So I do want to note that while the majority of that bond money will go towards broadly adaptation and resilience work, both APGP and RRGP, the two programs evaluated as a part of our project series, are not to receive any additional funding through Proposition 4. But that said, Prop 4 will support multi-year investments in a number of related issue areas and a number of programs that were also impacted by the 2024 state budget. So the one I want to note in particular, ICARP operates a third grant program, the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Grant Program. And that grant program is set to receive $50 million in funding through the climate bond. So there are absolutely opportunities here for the state to kind of think about how to take advantage of investments that will come over this multi-year bond to support existing grantees who are now underway, taking planning efforts underway that have been funded by previous state programs. And this is where we talk about kind of that funding the life cycle, right? So something about bond funds in particular, these are typically dedicated toward capital investments and long-term improvements, and especially around infrastructure projects, right? And so these steps usually take place at that like implementation stage in a project's life cycle. And so while we probably won't see Prop 4 funds filling the like existing gaps for planning money, which we know is really important, we do see it as an opportunity to continue funding projects through the life cycle. And that's really exciting to see. We know that ensuring that these projects continue to receive funding means that there's greater investment and return on state investment. And that, additional funds could be accessible in the future. I think the last thing I'll flag here with Prop 4 that I think is really important to note, because it aligns with a lot of the priorities of these programs, APGP and RRGP, 40% of the climate bond funds will directly benefit California's climate vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. And that's really significant in helping to make an impact on closing the gap in climate preparedness between communities that have seen historic and ongoing underinvestment and therefore disproportionately impacted by climate change. I think I covered all your question, but let me know if I missed anything there. I mean, the second part was about, how do we continue to fill this gap? Like, is it bonds? Is it like, what is the way to kind of continue to build this pot of money? I'll start it off and then see if Kasha and Shruti have anything to add. I think that the passage of the bond is really significant. I think what could be really critical here for the state, recognizing the challenging budget situation, is to really think about funding as kind of a holistic and proactive strategy, right? And that's why one of our recommendations here is actually developing a strategy that complements the adaptation strategy itself so that we understand, like, where are we going when it comes to funding and financing adaptation work? What is our long-term plan, knowing that we could see similar budget years in the future? And that means relying on a diversified funding portfolio that takes advantage of federal funds, but that also seeks out and takes advantage of private and philanthropic funds as well to develop something that's holistic and balanced rather than relying on a single funding source, which, as we noted, can contribute to that instability in the landscape. Kasha, Shruti, do you all have anything to add to that?
If not, I can just pick up a question that was posed in the Q&A, which follows up on this, which is noting that the state's greenhouse gas cap and trade program is slated for reauthorization next year. The question is, what recommendations might we have to integrate resilience into the funding allocations? I will maybe just take a brief stab at that on my end, which is that traditionally the cap and trade program funds, which are the California Climate Investments program, totaling billions of dollars a year now for a decade plus. Traditionally, those funds have been required to go toward emissions reduction strategies. And that has been defined pretty broadly, but they do have to typically be projects and programs that are intended to reduce emissions, directly playing into what the program is meant to do on the regulatory side. Now, that doesn't mean that a adaptation or resilience program project it has to be limited to those two things, and many adaptation and resilience projects do have emissions reduction components as well. So I think that would be probably the answer to how to integrate more of these types of investments into the cap and trade program fund would be primarily to identify those and lift up those that have an emissions reduction component as well, or to design new projects that have both sides of the equation in a comprehensive way through some of those natural and working lands and habitat conservation efforts that are known to also reduce or mitigate emissions. So that is one strategy to sort of access more funding. Of course, that is also a limited pool, which is also oversubscribed, and we end up with facing some of the same challenge. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about for a minute one thing that you guys have mentioned in the context of equity and also mentioned independently is the question of sort of local role in program design, local role in talking about where funds are dedicated. And I was curious, could you guys expand a little bit on what you mean by expanding the local role in these programs? What does local decision-making power mean in this context? And especially in the context of some of the case studies that you did, are there examples of really prominent local voice coming through those 3 or 4 examples that we talked about earlier? I don't know if that's maybe for Kasha, who raised the point, or Shruti on the case studies to pick up. Curious what you guys think.
Kasha, would you like to take that?
I'm happy to start it off. But when we think about local governance through these programs, it's really about ensuring that these funds can be utilized most effectively, and decisions about the utilization of these funds can be contextualized based on place-based needs of that community or of that region in the case of RRGP. And APGP on a local level and RRGP on a more regional scale built in several factors of local governance that we found were really strong additions to the state's funding portfolio. And we found that they were really important in terms of facilitating some equity-oriented measures, whether that was some innovative governance structures of forming an agency community collaborative, for example, where you have community-based organizations working with a local jurisdiction to engage in more in-depth community engagement and decision-making processes about the community's adaptation and resilience needs, or specifically within the program guidelines, the types of set-asides and mechanisms within program design that really uplifted tribal resilience and local governance over the types of projects that were implemented. I know, Shruti, maybe you'd want to add some about the specific types of case studies, or Hannah, if you have any other thoughts about local governance in this context.
I think, yeah, one example of that could be the Ramona Barona Climate Adaptation and Action Plan case study. We can paste the link to that in the chat soon. But yeah, for that, the project lead is the Ramona Municipal Water District, and the climate risks that they address are wildfire, flooding, extreme weather, and drought. And yeah, and they're building a climate action plan along with the County of San Diego. Yeah, I can paste the link in the chat for more details. So, okay. Hannah, did you want to add anything to it?
No, I think you all covered that really well. Thanks.
So one of the main areas of focus, one of the main challenges and the focus of the recommendations is the complexity of these programs. You mentioned, I think up to 17 administering agencies, which is obviously a lot. At the same time, we're also talking about a very expansive field. Adaptation and resilience covers a lot of different communities, a lot of different landscapes, and it's hard to imagine a single entity being fully responsible for it. So I'm curious if you guys can talk a bit about, to the extent that the existing ICARP or existing structures that you talked about would be a home for some consolidation. How would you envision that sort of functioning in practice? What would be the real benefits of that for the programs, the projects themselves, for the recipients and the applicants?
Yeah, I can get us started and then hand it over. So this recommendation really came to be through interviews with grantees. So we interviewed grantees from both round one of APGP and RRGP to understand their experience, both with the specific programs that they were receiving funds from, but also with the funding landscape more holistically. And one of the notable findings there was the degree to which ICARP staff, specifically program grant staff, have been supporting applicants and grantees in navigating the funding landscape in a really informal role, right? So through office hours, through grant guideline working sessions, and kind of like side conversations and over email, staff have been able to support grantees and applicants in identifying the right grant program for their particular project, right? And this takes significant staff time. And as an informal process, it really it can really reintroduce some of the challenges we've already identified around instability and oversubscription, right? And so because ICARP is already kind of well suited to fill this role as kind of a central education and support hub around adaptation and resilience tools, we see it as kind of the right place to put like some sort of kind of centralized navigation support hub that is able to help applicants and grantees navigate funding opportunities, and then also think about balancing funding plans. And maybe you're going to get to this Q&A, but I saw a question in the chat about kind of boosting, how do we boost these funds with philanthropic and private sources too? And the way I was going to answer that is a little bit higher level. It was really that the state can play a significant role in helping applicants understand, like, okay, if you get funding from APGP, here are a wide variety of other private and philanthropic sources that may be accessible to you, or here are federal grant programs that, having an adaptation plan through APGP may make you eligible for. That technical assistance is significant, particularly for communities that don't have the staff capacity to spend time seeking out grant opportunities and then understanding how to link them. That's a lot of work, especially when we recognize not just the complexity of California's funding landscape, but the complexity of the national funding landscape too. And then when you bring in philanthropic and private sources, that is kind of an added challenge. The last thing I'll say is that, in this kind of centralized funding hub navigation resource that we've somewhat envisioned, there may be an opportunity for the state to kind of pilot some interesting and different ways of providing that technical support and assistance. So one model that's been noted in a couple of resources and that we took a look at, the state of Colorado developed regional grant navigators program that were funded by the governor's office. And these are 13 dedicated staff who operate out of the Council of Governments across the state of Colorado. And their role is specifically to support local governments and applicants navigating funding opportunities from recent federal investments. So from the IIJA and the IRA, the Infrastructure Law and the Jobs Act. And, you know, that model, having kind of a centralized place to go to and a particular person who might be in charge of helping you navigate funding sources, is something the state of California could explore at a different scale, and for kind of different sectors if interested. And again, if with like appropriate state support.
And that's actually the Colorado example is an interesting one, because in the area where I've done a lot of work, which is in the electric vehicle access space, state of Colorado also has an example of regional access coordinators. I'm curious, I actually don't know if it's the same program, and that has been described as incredibly valuable, in particular, reaching across a very diverse and large state with a mix of urban centers and pretty rural areas, where communication around these types of topics, which ranges from differences in how you communicate about vehicles and travel to how you communicate about adaptation and resilience, the value of having a regional county level or other coordinator and contact point can be quite high, versus everyone reaching a single state point of contact, which has a particular language and a particular sort of set of approaches. So that seems valuable across multiple climate investment sectors.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add, it made me think of another finding that we heard from applicants. So many noted that actually having state staff come down to their project site and meet with them in person was really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a good opportunity for them to ask questions, to better understand their funding relationship with the state and with the agency. And I'm just thinking that, the state obviously doesn't have the capacity, at least right now, to do that for every single grantee and every single grant program it operates, but seeing the value in that kind of like FaceTime interaction between state staff and these implementing actors on the ground, suggests for me that regional models might facilitate that, and continue to encourage those partnerships that can then lead to kind of longer term partnerships between funding actors and implementing actors.
There's a question, Kenny, you mentioned the question in the chat about leveraging and boosting private sector investment in particular. In our past work, there have been examples that we've looked into that have moved slowly, things like forest resilience bonds, things like parametric insurance policies for very specific wildfire and other types of risks in the climate space that have been developing in the past few years as essentially a resilience investment funding mechanism. And what they all do is they're not just offered by a private financial entity, but they integrate private, corporate and other partners who have a financial interest in resilience above and beyond what the local government and the community does. And I'm curious, in the programs that projects that these programs funded, to what extent, if any, did you see private industry, private partners as part of the planning process? Where frankly, their financial interest in a resilient and sustained ecosystem, whether they are a consumer of water or a producer of forest products, where that interest financially aligns with that of the community and the local government. Is that something that has come up in these programs?
Not one project comes to mind immediately. And I would need to go back through and kind of look at the many partners associated with these projects. So with 34, I might get that number wrong, 34 projects funded between round ones of APGP and RRGP. And then one of the models for both grant programs was to encourage kind of multi-sector partnerships and collaborations, but that means that every project has upwards of 5 or 6 co-applicants. So off the top of my head, I can't answer that, but I can go back and take a look at kind of at the applicant list. And then I would also encourage both program websites have listed all of their awardees too. And so that's also an opportunity to kind of go through and see who are the partners on each of these projects. But Kasha or Shruti, if either of you have memory of partnership there, welcome you to jump in, but no worries if not.
I also don't have a memory of private sector funding supporting the projects that we spoke with through APGP and RGP, although that definitely may exist, as to Hannah's point. But I will say that we did see a lot of stacked and layered funding from other federal and state and local sources. That's something that came across over and over again. And I know that's something that APGP and RGP staff have really put in a lot of effort in terms of encouraging and supporting local jurisdictions and applicants to these programs to seek out. And that really speaks to, again, the demand and the high level of funding necessary to carry out these projects. So while many of the grantees that we spoke with were getting funding from many sources, those were usually public funds.
Great. And then one question that came in earlier that I wanted to get to and haven't gotten there yet. You mentioned at the beginning that the adaptation plans that are developed through these programs should align with other existing climate and other types of plans. Can you just talk a little bit about, very briefly, what is that ecosystem of plans that these programs should be kind of slotting into at the local level?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And plan alignment has been a huge focus for ICARP, especially the last few years. So I'll flag a couple of things here, but first, to answer the question directly, hazard mitigation plans, it's really critical that adaptation plans and hazard mitigation plans are aligned. These are efforts that jurisdictions take to ensure that they are mitigating against a wide variety of natural hazards, and that is, yeah, especially interlinked with climate adaptation and risk, especially in places that face high exposure to risks. It's also important to consider aligning climate adaptation plans with more general planning processes like the general plan. A lot of jurisdictions are going through updates to general plan elements right now and can think about how to weave in and consider adaptation needs when taking on general plan update processes, because as we know, adaptation really kind of keyly links in with a lot of different sectors that local governments are thinking about through across these planning processes. I'll flag that, so one of our recommendations, right, is for program administrators to really advance and encourage plan alignment. And ICARP has already invested kind of significant staff time and energy in helping applicants do so, particularly through their Climate Resilience Plan Alignment Toolkit, which was first published in December of 2022. That tool is on ICARP's website. We can drop a link in there, but it's designed to aid jurisdictions in taking on plan alignment processes. And there are toolkits for the different types of plans you might want to align that'll really walk you through that process. And our hope is that jurisdictions will continue to use that tool and then provide feedback so that ICARP can continue to refine the tool to make sure that it really reflects the needs of communities.
Great, thanks, Hannah. All right, so we are just in our final minute here. And before we close, I want to go back to each of you for just a 30-second closing thought based on what we've discussed today. One key takeaway that you would like the audience to take from this work, from the work that you've done over the past year, or from the questions that we've had. And I'm going to start with Kasia, if you would give us just 30 seconds on sort of what has been the biggest takeaway for you in this project.
Thanks, Ted. I will say the biggest takeaway has been just the extent to which California's adaptation landscape is really robust. And when we talk about streamlining these grant opportunities and we talk about streamlining the landscape and making funding more accessible, I think it's really important to also keep in mind that there are a lot of funding opportunities out there. They just happen to be spread out across so many different agencies and departments. And some of these points that we've been talking about in terms of strategically linking them together in a way that makes them more accessible and providing that assistance to applicants can really go a long way, because the foundation that the state has in adaptation and broadly in climate action is so strong. And so it's really been a privilege to get to interact with that work, and of course to get to work so closely with the ICARP staff, whose programs have been really inspiring for all of us.
Great, thanks, Kasia. Shruti?
Yes, my biggest takeaway throughout this project has been, like, my most enjoyable moments have been interviewing the grantees and getting to know their projects and how these programs have actually helped them. And sometimes they would make me emotional because they were just so appreciative of the state's funding and the grants. And that's why and interacting with them and also interacting with the ICARP staff and seeing how passionate they are about actually getting these resources to the people who need them. So yeah, I'm just hopeful. That's my takeaway. Hannah?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kasia and Shruti, and thanks again, Ted. Just to close this out, I think my biggest takeaway has been that there is a significant opportunity for the state to be really proactive here. and to really build on, as Kasia mentioned, decades of investment in climate work and streamline this funding landscape to make sure that it really aligns with the state's broader adaptation funding framework. And I'll add the degree to which grassroots organizations and adaptation experts and community practitioners have already been thinking about ways to improve this landscape, I think provides the state with far more recommendations than it probably knows what to do with, right? But like that is exciting, that there are folks that have really innovative ideas out there for how to improve this landscape and ensure that funds get to communities that really need them. And that's exciting for me. And I'm looking forward to kind of seeing where the state's able to take that.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for ending on a fairly hopeful note, I think. Thank you all for your comments and your presentation today. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thanks to our Lunch and Learn partners and to the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation for their support of this work. And please join us for our next Lunch and Learn in 2 weeks on Wednesday, December 4th. Professors Sharon Jacobs and Dan Farber are going to reflect on the recent elections and potential implications for climate, energy, and environmental policy, a light topic. So thanks everyone for joining us and have a great rest of your week.